Chapter 1. Blood and Borders. The forest floor was a thief, stealing the breath from her lungs with every frantic step. Branches, like skeletal fingers, clawed at Raina's tunic, ripping threads that she couldn't spare. Pine needles dug into the soles of her worn boots, 1,000 tiny tortures. She didn't dare look back. To look back was to see the fire, to smell the ruin of her life smoldering in the ash-choked air. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a wild drumbeat against the sudden terrible silence of the woods. They were gone. All of them. Just gone. A memory, sharp and cruel, lanced through her panic. Her mother's face, serene even as the raiders dragged her away, her wrist glowing with the same soft silver light that now pulsed under Raina's own skin. "Your gift is a whisper, little moon," her mother had told her, a story spun beside a crackling fire years ago. Never let them hear you scream. Raina stumbled over a root, her ankle twisting with a sickening pop. Pain, white-hot and blinding, flared up her leg. She cried out, a sound swallowed by the indifferent trees. The light on her wrist flared brighter in response to her agony, a beacon for the monsters hunting her. No. Driven by a surge of pure adrenaline, she ignored the fire in her leg and clawed her way forward. The glow was a death sentence. She knew this because she had seen what happened to those who couldn't hide it. Her mother's truth had been a beautiful, deadly thing. So Raina plunged her hand into the mud and grime, smearing the filth over her skin, praying it would be enough. She smeared it thick, the cold, wet earth a shocking balm against her feverish skin. The silver light dimmed, choked into submission beneath a layer of dirt and drying blood from a cut on her arm. She was no one, a runaway, a survivor with no name and no light. That was the only way. Another step, and then another. The world began to tilt, the tall pines blurring into a dizzying smear of green and brown. Her lungs burned, each gasp a ragged, useless effort. She could feel the edge of something, a strange energy shimmering in the air ahead, a border, a pack's territory line. It hummed against her skin like a plucked string, a warning and a potential sanctuary. Hope was a dangerous, stupid thing, but it was all she had left. She pushed herself onward, her vision tunneling until all she could see was that invisible line. Could she make it? Just a few more feet. The forest floor rushed up to meet her as her strength finally gave out. Her last conscious thought wasn't of the men who had destroyed her world, but of the chilling stillness that had followed their rampage. A quiet that promised a different kind to come. As darkness pulled her under, she felt the subtle shift in the earth beneath her cheek. She had crossed over. The hum of the border was behind her now. She was on their land, and she had no idea if they were better or worse than the ones she had just outrun. Chapter 2. The Alpha's Gaze. Raina woke to the scent of damp earth, wood smoke, and something else. Something wild and musky. A wolf. Her eyes flew open. She wasn't in the forest. She lay on a hard-packed dirt floor inside a rustic chamber, the walls made of thick, dark timber. Gray morning light filtered through a single high window. 4 men stood around her, their arms crossed over their broad chests. They weren't men. Not really. They were wolves in human skin, their predatory stillness making the air thick and heavy. She scrambled backward, her back hitting the cold wall as her heart leaped into her throat. "She's awake," one of them grunted, his voice a low rumble. He had a thick, graying beard and eyes the color of chipped slate. He looked at her not with pity, but with a cold, assessing curiosity, like a hunter examining a caught snare. "The Alpha will see her," another commanded, stepping forward. He was younger, with a restless energy that made her skin prickle. They pulled her to her feet, her twisted ankle screaming in protest. She bit down on her lip to keep from crying out, refusing to show them any more weakness. They wouldn't see her as prey. They wouldn't. They marched her out of the small holding cell and into a vast central hall. The air was filled with the sounds of a living, breathing pack. The murmur of voices, the clang of a blacksmith's hammer in the distance, the smell of roasting meat. But it all fell silent as she was dragged through. Every head turned, every pair of eyes, gold, brown, green, fixed on her. Whispers followed in her wake, like dry leaves skittering across stone. She felt stripped bare, her dirty, torn clothes a testament to her desperation. At the far end of the hall, on a raised dais, sat a throne carved from the trunk of an ancient oak. And on it sat him. He was taller than the others, his shoulders a broad line of contained power. A jagged scar sliced through one dark eyebrow, giving his face a permanently severe expression. His hair was black as a starless night, and his eyes were a piercing, glacial gray that seemed to see right through her skin, into the terrified flutter of her soul. This was their alpha, Kael Draven. His name was a whisper of dread even in her own lands, a ruler known for his iron control and ruthless justice. They threw her to her knees before him. The stone floor was cold against her skin. "Found at the northern border, Alpha," the gray-bearded one announced. "No scent of our enemies on her, but she's an outsider." Kael Draven didn't speak. He just watched her, his gaze so intense it felt like a physical weight. Under that silent scrutiny, a faint warmth began to spread from her wrist. Panic seized her. No, not now. The mud was starting to flake away. A tiny sliver of silver light pulsed, barely visible in the dim hall. But he saw it. A muscle in his jaw twitched. His eyes narrowed, and for a fleeting second, their cold gray flickered with a flash of gold. A low sound, barely audible, vibrated through the floor. A growl. It wasn't a threat. It was something else. Something possessive. Ancient. His wolf, which legend said had been silent for years, was stirring. "Who are you?" His voice was a low baritone, calm and cold, but it carried an authority that vibrated in her bones. Death was here. Execution was the law for trespassers. She knew it. Her mind raced, a frantic scramble for a way out. Her mother's face flashed in her mind again. The truth is a death sentence. The lie, then. It had to be the lie. It was all she had. Raina lifted her chin, forcing a strength she didn't feel into her voice. She had one chance, one insane, desperate gamble. She let her eyes meet his, a silent challenge. "You can't kill me," she blurted out, her voice trembling but clear in the stunned silence of the hall. The words hung in the air, audacious and mad. Kyle's expression remained frozen, but that flicker of gold in his eyes intensified. The pack gasped, a collective intake of breath. "And why is that?" he finally asked, his voice dangerously soft. Raina took a deep breath, the lie tasting like ash on her tongue. "Because I'm your mate." Chapter 3. A Cage of Gold and Shadow. The world held its breath. For a terrifying second, Raina was certain he would laugh, or simply give the order to end her. Instead, Kael Draven's face was a mask of stone, revealing nothing but the feral gold now swirling in his gray eyes. The growl she'd felt before rumbled audibly in his chest this time, a possessive, frustrated sound that sent a shiver down her spine. It wasn't a growl of rejection. It was a growl of recognition. His wolf believed her, even if the man did not. "Take her to my quarters," he commanded, his voice tight with some powerful, restrained emotion. "Lock the door." His guards hesitated, their eyes wide with shock, before grabbing her arms and hauling her away from the throne. As they dragged her up a winding stone staircase, Raina dared a glance back. Kael was still on his throne, his hands gripping the armrests so tightly his knuckles were white. He wasn't looking at his pack. He was looking only at her, his expression a storm of confusion, rage, and something else she couldn't name. Something that looked terrifyingly like hope. The heavy oak door to his chambers slammed shut behind her, the sound of the key turning in the lock echoing with a dreadful finality. She was alone, and she was trapped. Her own lie had become her prison. Her legs finally gave out and she slid down the door to the floor, wrapping her arms around her knees. A single, dry sob escaped her lips. What had she done? After a few minutes of shaking, she forced herself to stand. Survival instinct was a stubborn thing. She limped through the rooms, taking stock of her gilded cage. It was large and Spartan, much like the Alpha himself. A massive bed with dark furs, a stone fireplace, a heavy wooden desk with maps and papers stacked in neat, precise piles. There were no decorations, no personal trinkets, save for a single tarnished silver locket sitting on the nightstand. The air smelled of him, pine, cold stone, and that wild, clean scent of wolf. It was everywhere, a constant, intimidating presence. It was the scent of the predator who now believed she belonged to him. This was a place of control, of rigid discipline. It was the den of a man who chained his own emotions. Why would a man like that have a wolf that would so readily claim a stranger? Her mother had told her stories of the fated, of the moon goddess's bond that was meant to be instant and unbreakable. But this felt different. Broken. A lie forced into a crack in his soul. Because something about him was broken. She could feel it. A deep, cold wound that had nothing to do with the scar on his face. The sun began to set, casting long, lonely shadows across the room. She found a basin of water and washed the grime from her face and arms, carefully cleaning around her wrist. The moon healer's mark, a delicate spiral of silver lines, shone faintly in the twilight. It was a curse. A death sentence that she now had to pretend was a mark of destiny. She was a healer, yet she had to feign a bond with a man whose pack would kill her if they knew the truth. Because the truth was a luxury she couldn't afford. The door clicked open, making her jump. Kael stood there, filling the doorway. He held a tray with a piece of bread, some cheese, and a cup of water. He set it down on a small table, his movements deliberate and quiet. He hadn't come to kill her. Not yet. He prowled the room, his silent presence more unnerving than any threat. Finally, he stopped in front of her, his shadow swallowing her whole. "You will stay here," he said, his voice a low command. "You will not leave this room." He was testing her, watching her every reaction. Raina simply nodded, her throat too dry to speak. He took another step closer, his glacial eyes fixed on her wrist, which she instinctively tried to hide. "The full moon is in 2 nights," he stated, his voice dropping lower, laced with something that sounded like a threat and a promise. "Every member of this pack will be watching. You will prove this bond you claim we have." He leaned in, his voice a mere whisper now, his warm breath ghosting across her ear. "Or they will watch me tear the lie from your throat." Chapter 4. The Moon's Test. Raina woke with a gasp, the scent of pine and cold stone filling her senses. For a moment, she was lost, adrift in the unfamiliar dark. Then it all came rushing back. The chase, the lie, the Alpha. She was in his bed. The furs beneath her were heavy and smelled faintly of him, a wild, musky scent that was both terrifying and strangely comforting. Sunlight streamed through the high window, painting a golden slash across the stone floor. She was a prisoner in the heart of the beast's den. A new kind of fear, colder and sharper than the panic of the chase, settled in her stomach. She had survived the night, but she had traded a quick death for a slow, terrifying one. A soft knock came at the door before an older woman entered with a tray. Her face was a road map of wrinkles, but her eyes were kind. "The Alpha sent breakfast," she said softly. "And these." She laid out a simple but clean tunic and leggings of dark green wool. "You are to be ready by nightfall." The woman's gaze was full of a question she didn't dare ask, a mix of awe and suspicion. Raina was an anomaly, a disruption to the rigid order of this pack. She was either a miracle or a curse. The day passed in a blur of anxiety. Raina forced herself to eat the bread and cheese, knowing she needed her strength. Her mind raced, trying to remember the stories her mother had told her about the fated. How was a mate supposed to act? She was a healer, taught to mend and soothe, not to act in a grand play of cosmic destiny. the weight of 1,000 pairs of eyes, the judgment of an entire pack, pressed down on her. Her greatest fear was not that they would see through her lie, but that she would see the disappointment in their faces, because these people, as harsh as they were, yearned for their alpha to have a mate, for the pack to have a Luna. She was a false hope she had sold them to save her own skin. As dusk settled, Kael appeared at her door. He said nothing, simply watched her with those unnerving, assessing eyes. He was dressed in black leather, which made him look even more like a creature of the night. He held out his arm. His meaning was clear. She was to walk with him, to play the part of his mate. Her hand trembled as she placed it on his forearm. His muscles were hard as rock beneath the leather. A jolt like lightning shot up her arm. It was unexpected and powerful, making her gasp. Kael's eyes flickered down to her hand, his jaw tightening. He felt it too. He led her to a high cliff overlooking the valley, where the entire pack had gathered in a silent circle. A massive bonfire roared in the center, spitting sparks into the darkening sky. The air was thick with anticipation. They stood her beside him at the edge of the circle, directly in the moonlight that was beginning to spill over the mountain peaks. He hadn't let go of her arm. His grip was like an iron band, the only thing keeping her knees from buckling. She could feel the tremors starting deep inside him, the struggle of the man against the beast. Then, the full moon crested the peak, a brilliant, impossible white. A collective howl rose from the pack, a symphony of wild, primal voices that shook the very air. Kael threw his head back, a strangled groan ripping from his throat. His body contorted, his bones cracking and reforming with sickening speed. This was not a gentle, romantic transformation. It was a violent, brutal battle for control. His eyes bled from gray to pure, molten gold. Fur sprouted along his jaw. His fingers curled into claws that ripped through his leather gloves. His wolf was a magnificent, terrifying creature of shadow and fury. It was larger than any wolf she had ever seen, its fur the color of a stormy night sky. But its golden eyes were not filled with the love of a mate. They were filled with a caged rage, a desperate hunger. The wolf turned its massive head and fixed its gaze on her. A deep, rumbling growl started in its chest, a sound of pure possession. It took a step toward her, its lips peeling back to reveal gleaming white fangs. The pack fell silent. This was the test. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She was supposed to show a connection, a calm acceptance. But all she felt was a raw, paralyzing terror. Her trembling was no longer an act. The great wolf lunged, not to attack, but to claim. It stopped inches from her, its hot breath washing over her face, its growl vibrating through her entire body. It lowered its head and pressed its giant snout into her stomach, a gesture so forceful it almost knocked her over. Mine. The word wasn't spoken, but it slammed into her mind with the force of a physical blow. Kael's wolf hadn't just accepted her. It had branded her. He lifted his head, a triumphant and savage howl tearing through the night, a declaration to his pack, to the moon, to the world. And as he stared down at her, Kael, the man, trapped somewhere inside the beast, seemed to be asking one terrifying question. Why? Chapter 5. The Beast. Within. The 2 days following the moon's test were a strange, new kind of prison. Raina was no longer locked in Kael's chambers. Her cage was now the Alpha himself. He had commanded her to stay close, and his word was law. She walked beside him through the bustling settlement, a silent shadow at his elbow. She sat at his table during meals, the space around them a bubble of tense silence that no one dared to break. The pack watched her with a newfound reverence, a fearful respect. She was the woman who had faced the Alpha's untamed wolf and survived. They saw her as a miracle. She felt like a fraud counting down the seconds until her exposure. This forced closeness was a constant strain on her nerves. She was acutely aware of everything about him, The way he moved with a fluid, predatory grace, the deep timbre of his voice when he gave orders, the way his eyes would occasionally flick to her, a flicker of that golden light betraying the wolf just beneath the surface. She saw the immense effort it took for him to maintain his iron control. He was a man at war with himself, and she was somehow now at the center of that war. The breaking point came unexpectedly in the middle of the training grounds. Warriors slammed into each other with controlled brutality, their grunts and the thud of bodies on dirt echoing in the crisp morning air. Raina sat on a bench, tasked with tending to minor cuts and scrapes, a duty that felt dangerously close to her hidden truth. Kael was overseeing the sparring, his expression unreadable, his posture rigid. Suddenly, 2 guards burst from the forest edge, dragging a wiry, desperate-looking man between them. "A scout, Alpha!" one of the guards shouted. "From the Black River Pack, caught sniffing around our southern border." A ripple of hostility went through the training grounds. The Black River Pack were opportunistic scavengers, rivals who constantly tested Kael's defenses. A low growl spread through the assembled warriors. But no growl was as deep, as menacing, as the one that rumbled in Kael's chest. His entire demeanor shifted. The air around him grew cold, heavy with a palpable threat. His eyes, which had been a clear, cool gray, began to swirl with that terrifying molten gold. "What were you looking for?" Kael's voice was dangerously quiet, a storm gathering on the horizon. The scout spat on the ground. "Wouldn't you like to know, Draven? Heard your pack was getting soft. Heard your curse was finally breaking you." It was the wrong thing to say. Kael moved faster than Raina would have thought possible. One moment he was standing 10 feet away, the next he was in front of the scout, his hand clamped around the man's throat, lifting him off the ground. "You will not speak of things you do not understand," he snarled, his voice a guttural sound that was more wolf than man. His own warriors took a step back, their faces pale with a familiar fear. They had seen this before. This was the edge he so carefully walked. The scout clawed at Kael's wrist, his face turning purple. Kael's fingers began to change, his nails thickening, elongating into black, vicious claws that started to pierce the scout's skin. He was losing control. The beast was surging forward, and no one was going to stop it. Raina didn't think. She acted. The sight of a life about to be torn away, the sudden surge of uncontrolled violence, it triggered something deep inside her. Her healer's instinct, buried under layers of fear and lies, screamed to the surface. She shot up from the bench, her own terror forgotten. Before anyone could react, she rushed forward and placed her hand flat on Kael's arm. "Kael," she said, her voice a sharp, clear command. "Let him go." The effect was like dousing a flame with water. The golden rage in his eyes flickered, then receded. The claws retracted. His grip loosened, and the scout dropped to the ground, gasping for air. Kael stood frozen, his chest heaving, his entire body trembling with the effort of shoving the wolf back into its cage. He stared down at her hand on his arm as if he'd been burned. His gaze lifted to meet hers, and in his eyes, she saw not the cold Alpha, but a man utterly shocked, bewildered, and afraid. Afraid of the beast inside him. And now, afraid of the one person who had just proven she could somehow tame it. Chapter 6. A Whispered Confession. The silence in Kael's chambers that night was a living thing. It coiled in the corners and slithered across the stone floor, thick with everything that had happened at the training grounds. Kael hadn't spoken a word to her since the incident. He had dismissed the scout with a chillingly calm order of banishment, his control perfectly restored, a mask of iron slammed back into place. But now, in the privacy of their forced intimacy, the mask was cracking. He paced before the fireplace, a caged wolf restless and tormented. The flames cast dancing shadows that clung to him, making him seem larger, wilder. Raina sat on the edge of the bed, her hands clenched in her lap, her heart a frantic bird beating against her ribs. She had exposed herself, not as a healer, not yet, but as something more, something that had power over him. And in this world, Power was a thing to be coveted, controlled, or destroyed. Finally, he stopped his pacing and turned to face her. "What are you?" he asked, his voice a low, rough rasp. It wasn't an accusation. It was a plea. A desperate man searching for an answer to a question that was tearing him apart. No one has ever been able to do that before, to pull me back. Raina's throat was dry. The lie was ready on her tongue. It's the bond, the mate bond. It was the easy answer, the safe one. But looking at the raw vulnerability in his eyes, the words caught in her throat. For the first time, she saw beyond the fearsome alpha to the prisoner within. This man was just as trapped as she was, but his cage was his own skin. She stood up, taking a hesitant step toward him. "I don't know," she whispered, and it was the most honest thing she had said to him. I saw you. You saw the monster." He finished for her, a bitter, self-loathing edge to his voice. He turned away, staring into the fire. For years I have kept it chained. After my brother, after the curse, my wolf became a thing of pure rage, silent, caged. He spoke to the flames, but his words were meant for her. He was giving her a piece of his broken past, a shard of his story. It was a dull ache, a constant weight in my soul. I learned to rule with it, to control it, to never, ever let it have a voice. He turned back to her, and the desperation in his gaze pinned her in place. He crossed the distance between them in 2 long strides, stopping so close she could feel the heat radiating from his body. He didn't touch her, but his proximity was an overwhelming force. He was searching her face, his eyes tracing her features as if trying to decipher a language he'd never seen before. "And then you came," he breathed, his voice raw with a pain that shook her to her core. "You fell across my border, and for the first time in a decade, it woke up. It screamed, 'Mine.' It recognized you. And I don't understand why." He backed her against the cold stone wall, his hands coming up to brace himself on either side of her head. He was so close, she could see the flecks of gold in his eyes, the faint tremor in his hands. This wasn't a threat of violence. It was a surrender to utter confusion. The alpha who controlled everything was faced with the one thing he couldn't command, his own soul. He leaned in, his forehead resting against hers, a gesture of profound weariness. His confession, when it came, was a ragged whisper that shattered the last of her defenses. "It's a frenzy inside me, a constant battle, but when you are near, it quiets." He took a shuddering breath. "My wolf only breathes when you're near." The words hung between them, a terrifying, beautiful, and devastating truth. Her lie hadn't just saved her, it had become his anchor. She looked into the eyes of the most powerful and dangerous man she had ever met, and she saw not a monster, but a man drowning. And he believed she was the only one who could keep his head above water. Her heart ached with a terrible mix of guilt and a strange, unwelcome compassion. Her deception was a double-edged sword, and it was cutting them both. Chapter 7. The Healer's Shadow. Weeks bled into one another, each day a careful performance. Raina had found a precarious balance in her new life, a rhythm built on the shaky foundation of her lie. Kael had assigned her to the healer's den, a logical place for an alpha's mate to show her nurturing side. For Raina, it was both a sanctuary and a special kind of hell. The moment she stepped inside, the familiar scent of dried willow bark, chamomile, and antiseptic poultices wrapped around her like a ghost. It was the smell of her mother, of her home, of everything she had lost. The memories were so sharp they felt like a physical ache in her chest. The den was run by Alara, an ancient she-wolf whose face was as gnarled as an old oak root, and whose eyes held the wisdom of 100 winters. Alara was kind, but she was also observant. She set Raina to grinding herbs and binding simple wounds, tasks a novice could handle. But for Raina, it was a torment. Her hands, which knew the precise pressure to set a bone, had to feign clumsiness. Her mind, which held a deep knowledge of herbal interactions, had to pretend ignorance. She watched Alara treat a warrior's sprained wrist with a technique that was fine, but inefficient. The urge to step in, to gently correct her grip, to show her a faster way to reduce the swelling, was a physical fire in her veins. She had to constantly bite her tongue and clench her fists, forcing her healer's instincts into submission, because her knowledge was a beacon, and she was determined to remain in the shadows. This constant suppression left her feeling hollow and deeply lonely. She was surrounded by the pack, accepted as their Luna to be, yet she had never felt more isolated. They saw a symbol, a prophecy fulfilled. They didn't see the terrified girl who was so afraid of her own shadow, of the silver light that pulsed faintly on her wrist when she felt a surge of emotion. And Kael. Kael was always watching. He would appear at the doorway of the healer's den, a silent, brooding figure. He never said much, but his glacial gray eyes followed her every move. He wasn't just observing his mate. He was studying a puzzle he couldn't solve. He saw the way she watched Alara, the flicker of something profound in her eyes. He saw the tension in her shoulders as she deliberately wrapped a bandage a little too loosely. He didn't know what he was seeing, but he knew it wasn't the whole truth. His presence was a constant, unnerving pressure that made her careful performance even more difficult. It was like trying to thread a needle while a wolf stared over your shoulder. One afternoon, the flaps to the den were thrown open, and two warriors carried in a third, his leg laid open from knee to ankle by a boar's tusk. The wound was deep, dirty, and already showing the angry red signs of infection. Alara moved quickly, her face grim. She called for hot water and cleansing herbs, her movements practiced but strained. This was a serious injury, one that could cost the warrior his leg or even his life. Raina's training, her very blood, screamed at her. She saw three things Alara had missed: a splinter of tusk still embedded deep in the muscle, the faint gray tinge to the skin that signaled the onset of blood poisoning, and the way the man's breathing was becoming shallow. He was going into shock. Her power, the moon healer's gift, surged under her skin. It was a living thing, a warm silver hum that wanted out. It wanted to pour from her fingertips to seal the torn flesh, to fight the poison, to save this man's life. It was the purest, most undeniable part of her, and she had to crush it. She stood frozen, her hands clenched into fists at her sides, her knuckles white. A battle raged inside her, the healer versus the survivor. To save him would be to condemn herself. Alara began to stitch the wound, unknowingly sealing the infection inside. Raina squeezed her eyes shut, a silent scream trapped in her throat. The silver light on her wrist pulsed, a frantic, desperate beat against the dirty bandage she always kept tied around it. When she opened her eyes, her gaze shot to the doorway. Kael was standing there. And he wasn't looking at the wounded warrior. He was staring directly at her, his brow furrowed, his eyes narrowed on her face, on the agonizing, visible war she was fighting with herself. And in that moment, she knew. He was getting closer to a truth she could not afford for him to find. Chapter 8: Chains of Silver and Soul. The night after the incident in the healer's den, Kael was different. The silent, watchful distance was gone, replaced by a restless, brooding energy that filled his chambers. He didn't question her about what he'd seen. He seemed to understand that a direct assault would only be met with more of her carefully constructed walls. Instead, after a long, tense silence, he spoke 2 words. "Come with me." He led her not out into the settlement, but to a heavy iron-banded door tucked away in the back of his personal study. It was a door she had never seen opened. He produced a large, ancient key and turned the lock, the sound echoing in the quiet room. A wave of cold, still air washed over them, carrying the scent of damp stone and something else. A faint, metallic tang of old pain. He lit a torch from the wall sconce and started down a narrow, winding staircase, his hand gesturing for her to follow. The stairs descended deep into the earth beneath the Alpha's lodge. The air grew colder, the silence more profound. They emerged into a small, circular chamber carved directly from the bedrock. There was nothing in it. No furniture, no windows, just bare stone. And the chains. Thick, heavy chains of dulled silver were bolted directly into the stone walls, their lengths pooled on the floor like dead serpents. Scorch marks and deep gouges scarred the stone around the bolts, testament to a frantic, terrible strength. Raina stopped breathing. Silver. To a werewolf, it was pure agony. It didn't just burn their skin. It was a poison that seeped into their blood, sapping their strength, silencing their wolf. It was a weapon used by hunters, a tool of torture, and Kael had a room full of it in the very heart of his home. This, Kael's voice was a low, rough thing, stripped of his usual authority, is where I spend the full moon. He ran a hand over his face, the torchlight casting deep shadows under his eyes. The beast you saw on the cliff, the one that claimed you, it is a thing of pure rage. For years I have fought it, but its fury only grows. He walked to the center of the room and picked up one of the chains, the links clinking with a sound that seemed to echo with years of suffering. To protect my pack, to protect everyone from what I become on that night, I come down here. My most trusted betas lock me in. The silver, it weakens me. It holds the beast at bay. Just barely. He was showing her his greatest weakness, his most profound shame. He was trusting her with the one secret that could be used to destroy him. This wasn't a performance. This was raw, unvarnished truth. Raina felt the careful walls around her own heart begin to crumble. This cold, controlled alpha, this fearsome ruler, subjected himself to unimaginable torture every single month, all for the sake of his people. Her lie, her careful deceptions, suddenly felt so small, so selfish in the face of his sacrifice. A wave of compassion so strong it almost buckled her knees washed over her. It was an emotion she hadn't allowed herself to feel for anyone in a long, long time. She found her voice, though it was barely a whisper. Who chained you?" she asked, the question slipping out before she could stop it. Kael looked at her, and for the first time, she saw no trace of the wolf in his eyes. Only the man. A man burdened by a weight she couldn't possibly imagine. His answer shattered the last of her fear of him, replacing it with a deep, aching empathy. "Myself," he said simply. In that moment, he was not the alpha. He was not the beast. He was just Kael, a prisoner of his own power. Without thinking, she stepped forward and reached out, her fingers gently touching one of the cold, silver links in his hand. A jolt went through him at her touch, but he didn't pull away. He simply stood there, letting her into his pain, into his prison. It was the first honest moment they had ever shared, a fragile connection forged not by a lie of fate, but by a truth of shared suffering, and it was infinitely more powerful. Chapter 9. The Rival's Warning. The fragile truce between them, born in the cold silence of the stone cell, was shattered by the arrival of the Southern Pack. Their alpha, Lucen Ward, had requested a territorial council, an event that put the entire Northern Pack on edge. Lucen was everything Kael was not. Where Kael was a storm of raw power held in check, Lucen was a sleek, quiet river that could drown you before you ever realized the current was pulling you under. He arrived with a small elite guard, his smile easy and his eyes sharp and calculating. He was a fox walking into a den of wolves, and he seemed to enjoy every second of it. Raina was required to be at Kael's side during the welcome feast. She wore a deep blue tunic Kael had provided, a garment that made her feel like an imposter in queen's clothing. The great hall was filled with the low hum of conversation, but the tension was a sharp, metallic taste in the air. Lucen and Kael sat at the head table, a careful, empty space between them. From the moment Lucen's eyes landed on her, Raina felt a chill crawl up her spine. He didn't look at her with the awed reverence of the Northern Pack. He looked at her like a puzzle he was taking apart piece by piece, his gaze lingering, analytical. His smile was charming, but it didn't reach his eyes. Those eyes saw too much. Alpha Kael, Lucen began, his voice a smooth, pleasant baritone that carried easily through the hall. We hear congratulations are in order. The moon goddess has finally seen fit to bless your lands with a mate for its ruler. He raised his goblet to her. A surprise for us all, to be sure, after so many years. The words were polite, but the implication was a knife's edge. Where did you come from? Kael's hand rested on the table near hers, his fingers curling into a tight fist. The goddess works in her own time, he replied, his voice a low rumble of warning. Raina felt 100 pairs of eyes on her, waiting for her reaction. She had to play her part. Alpha Lucen is too kind, she said, forcing a small, polite smile. She hated the way his name felt in her mouth. The feast dragged on, a long exercise in veiled threats and political maneuvering. Raina stayed silent, trying to make herself as small as possible. But Lucen seemed determined to draw her out. He kept directing comments her way, asking about her supposed homeland, her family, all with that same predatory charm. Each question was a carefully aimed dart, forcing her to build her lie higher and more elaborately with every answer. She could feel Kael's simmering rage beside her, a protective fury that was a stark contrast to his usual iron control. Finally, as the feast was ending, Lucan stood, ostensibly to bid them good night. He walked around the table, his movements fluid and graceful. He stopped beside Raina's chair, bowing slightly. It has been an honor, Luna, he said, his voice dropping so only she could hear. He took her hand, his touch cool and dry, and raised it to his lips in a gesture of feigned respect. He leaned in closer, his smile never wavering, his warm breath a cold poison against her ear. A strange light for a wolf's mate, he whispered, his voice a silk-wrapped threat. Be careful it doesn't burn this whole forest down. Ice shot through Raina's veins. He knew. He didn't know what she was, but he knew she was not what she seemed. He had sensed her power, the hidden gift she fought so hard to conceal. He let go of her hand and straightened up, his pleasant mask perfectly in place. But his eyes held a triumphant glint. He had found Kael's weakness, and it was her. Before she could even react, Kael was on his feet. He moved so quickly he was a black blur, physically positioning himself between her and Lucen. He didn't touch the other alpha, but the air crackled with his fury. A growl, low and lethal, vibrated in his chest. The council is tomorrow, Ward. Keep your distance until then. Lucen's smile widened. He had gotten the reaction he wanted. He gave a slight bow and retreated, leaving a trail of chaos in his wake. Later that night, alone in the chambers, Kael paced again, but this time his restlessness wasn't from his own demons. It was for her. He finally stopped and looked at her, the wolf fully present in his golden-flecked eyes, a possessive, primal fire blazing there. He wants what's ours, he snarled, the words a guttural promise of violence. He wants you. The external threat had arrived, and it had a name. Lucen Ward would not stop digging until he had unearthed her secret. And Raina knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that when he did, he wouldn't just destroy her, he would use her to start a war. Chapter 10. The Cursed Lands. Lucen Ward was gone, but his presence lingered like a poison in the air. The northern pack was unsettled, the easy reverence they had shown Raina now tainted with the slightest edge of doubt. Lucen had planted a seed, and it was beginning to sprout in the shadows. Kael felt it too. He was more guarded than ever, his wolf a constant, restless presence just beneath his skin. The fragile connection they had forged in the stone cell felt distant, buried under a fresh layer of tension. The morning after the Southern Pack's departure, Kael appeared at her door, his face grim. He didn't speak, simply tossed her a heavy riding cloak. "Come," was all he said. She followed him to the stables, her heart pounding a nervous rhythm against her ribs. He seemed to need to escape the suffocating confines of the lodge, to run until the questions and suspicions couldn't keep up. They rode out, not towards the vibrant, living heart of the forest, but toward the blighted northern borderlands. The farther they rode, the more the world seemed to lose its color. The lush green canopy thinned, replaced by the skeletal, grasping branches of dead or dying trees. The rich, loamy scent of the forest floor gave way to the dry, dusty smell of decay. Here, the ground was cracked and barren, littered with gray, brittle leaves. It was a place where life had surrendered. Kael finally reined his horse to a stop at the crest of a hill that overlooked a desolate, gray valley. "This is the edge of my territory," he said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. "And it is the edge of my curse." He gestured to the blighted land below. 10 years ago, this valley was the most fertile in the region. When the curse took hold of me, the land began to die. It started here, and every year, the decay spreads a little farther. Raina stared, horrified. She had thought his curse was a personal torment, a battle fought within his own skin. She had never imagined it was a poison that was bleeding out into the world, killing his home from the inside out. The pack's lifeblood was tied to their alpha. His spirit was the land's spirit. Because he was broken, his kingdom was breaking with him. His burden was so much heavier than she had ever known. A wave of profound empathy, so powerful it made her dizzy, washed over her. It was the healer in her weeping for the dying earth. It was the woman in her, aching for the tormented man beside her. She slid off her horse, her legs unsteady. She took a few steps into the blighted soil, the ground crunching under her boots like old bones. A wave of faintness swept over her and she stumbled, her right hand instinctively shooting out to catch her fall. Her palm pressed flat against the dead, cracked earth. For a single, breathless moment, nothing happened. Then a soft, warm pulse of silver light, gentle as a heartbeat, flowed from her hand into the ground. It was an unconscious act, a pure reflex of her gift responding to so much pain. The light was visible for only a second, a faint shimmer that was swallowed by the gray daylight. But she felt it, a torrent of life pouring from her, leaving her feeling drained and breathless. She pulled her hand back as if she'd been burned. She stared at the spot, her heart hammering in her chest. Kael had dismounted and was walking towards her, his expression a thundercloud of confusion. "What's wrong?" he demanded. She couldn't answer. She could only point with a trembling finger. There, on the barren ground where her hand had rested, a small, perfect circle of vibrant green grass had sprouted. Delicate, impossible blades of life in a sea of death. It was a miracle. It was a confession. Kael stopped dead. He stared at the patch of grass, then at her, then back at the grass. The gears were turning in his mind, connecting dots she had tried so desperately to keep scattered. He looked at her hand, the one she now cradled against her chest, the one that still tingled with the ghost of her power. The suspicion in his eyes solidified into a hard, undeniable certainty. The question, when it came, was not angry. It was something far more dangerous, a demand wrapped in pure, undiluted awe. "What are you, Raina?" Chapter 11. The Bitter Truth. The ride back to the lodge was a silent, suffocating affair. Kael's question hung between them, unanswered and unasked again. He didn't push her, but his focus was absolute. He watched her with an intensity that stripped away all her defenses, leaving her feeling raw and exposed. She was no longer just a potential mate, a strange anomaly. She was an impossibility, a miracle he had stumbled upon, and he was a man who did not believe in miracles. The seed of doubt Lucen had planted was now a thriving, thorny vine, and Kael was ready to rip it from the ground, no matter what truth came with it. They had been back for less than an hour when the rider was spotted, a lone wolf from the southern pack moving at speed, carrying their banner of truce. He was brought to Kael's study, where Raina was still being held by the Alpha's silent, commanding presence. The rider bowed low, his eyes carefully avoiding Raina. "A gift for you, Alpha Draven," the rider announced, his voice steady but his scent laced with nervousness. "From my Alpha, Lucen Ward, a token of enlightenment." He presented a long, sealed scroll tube made of dark, polished wood. Kael took it, his eyes narrowing. He dismissed the rider with a curt nod. He stood there for a long moment, weighing the tube in his hand as if it were a venomous snake. Lucen did not give gifts. He laid traps. With a grim finality, he broke the wax seal and slid the contents onto his desk. It was a scroll of ancient, brittle parchment. It unrolled to reveal elegant, faded script and detailed drawings. Raina's blood ran cold. The drawings were of men and women with glowing hands, their wrists adorned with the familiar silver spiral. Her mark. It was a history she knew all too well. Kael began to read, his voice a low, dangerous murmur. He spoke of a forgotten lineage of healers, gifted by the moon goddess with the power to mend flesh and soothe the wild wolf spirit. He read of their power, a silver light that could bring life back to dying lands. And then he read of their persecution, of how other packs grew to fear their gift, hunting them down, branding them as aberrations. He was reading the story of her people, the story of her mother's murder. His voice grew tighter with every word. He was not just reading history, he was uncovering her secrets, one devastating sentence at a time. The scroll detailed their last known locations, the names of the families. Finally, his eyes landed on the last passage. The room was so quiet Raina could hear the frantic beat of her own heart. He read the final lines aloud, each word a hammer blow against her soul. The line was thought to be extinguished with the purging of the Silver Creek pack and the death of its last known healer, Lyra Vale. He paused, his gaze slowly, deliberately, lifting from the parchment to fix on her. Who was survived by a single daughter, whose name was Raina. Her name. The lie was shattered. Everything came crashing down around her, leaving her standing in the rubble of her own deception. There was no escape, no denial. Her silence was a confession. Kael stared at her, and his face was a terrifying canvas of conflicting emotions. Betrayal, sharp and cutting, was there in the tightening of his jaw. Fury was in the molten gold that burned in his eyes. But beneath it all, his wolf, the primal, possessive beast, was not enraged by the lie. It was roaring in triumph. He finally had his answer. She wasn't his fated mate because of some cosmic whim. She was something far more valuable. She was his cure. He slammed his fist on the desk, the sound making her flinch. "You lied to me," he snarled, the words ripping from his throat. She started, her voice a broken whisper. "I had to." He stalked around the desk, his presence overwhelming in the suddenly small room. He stopped before her, a whirlwind of fury and desperate need. He could kill her for her deceit, banish her, but he couldn't. His wolf would never allow it. The cure was finally within his grasp, and he would not let it go. "You will not leave my sight," he growled, his voice a low, possessive command. He grabbed her arm, his grip hard but not bruising, and dragged her towards the door to her chambers. "You will stay where I can watch you." He shoved her inside, the force of his turmoil a physical wave. He was locking her away again, but this was different. This wasn't for her safety, it was for his control. She was no longer a potential mate or a mysterious guest. She was a secret, a weapon, a priceless, dangerous asset that he now owned. And as the lock clicked shut, she knew she had never been in more danger. Chapter 12. The Goddess's Whisper. The silence of the chambers was a tomb. Before it had been a gilded cage, a place of suspense and uncertainty. Now it was a true prison. The lie was gone, and with it, the strange, fragile shield it had provided. Kael knew her name. He knew what she was. And he had locked her away, not as a woman, but as a thing. A cure to be guarded, a power to be controlled. The pack's whispers, which she could hear faintly from the window, had changed. The awe was gone. replaced by the sharp, ugly hiss of suspicion and fear. She was an outsider, a liar, a witch. Days blurred into a haze of despair. Kael did not come to see her. Food was left at her door by silent guards who refused to meet her eyes. She was utterly alone, adrift in a sea of her own guilt and terror. What was he planning? Was he waiting for the right moment to reveal her to the pack and cast her out? Or was he trying to figure out how to force her to heal him? The not knowing was a slow, grinding torture. Sleep offered the only escape, but it was a fitful, dream-plagued thing. On the third night, she fell into a deep, feverish slumber. The world of stone and shadow dissolved, replaced by an endless expanse of shimmering silver light. She was floating in a sea of stars, the full moon hanging above her like a benevolent, watchful eye. There was no fear here, only a profound sense of peace, of coming home. A presence surrounded her, ancient and overwhelmingly powerful. It had no voice, but it spoke directly to her soul. Moonchild. The words were made of starlight and sorrow. The moon goddess. Images, sharp and vivid, flooded her mind. She saw Kael as a boy, laughing with an older brother who had the same glacial gray eyes. She saw them sparring, their young wolf forms a blur of joyous play. Then the vision soured. An ambush. The flash of silver blades. The brother falling, a cursed arrow in his side. She felt Kael's howl of grief, a sound that tore the fabric of the world. And she felt the goddess's response, not a curse of malice, but one of desperate, grieving protection. The goddess had caged the part of Kael's wolf that was connected to his brother, the part that was dying from the loss, hoping to save him. But the cage had festered, turning his wolf into a creature of pure, silent rage. The vision shifted. She saw Kael's wolf, the magnificent, terrifying beast, pacing in the cage of Kael's soul. But it wasn't looking out at the world. It was looking only at her. Its golden eyes were filled with a desperate, obsessive hunger. It craved her not as a mate, but as the key to its prison. The goddess's message imprinted itself onto her heart, a chilling, undeniable truth. Heal him, or he will destroy you both. The curse was not stable. With her presence awakening the beast, it was growing stronger, more volatile. If she did not heal the rift in his soul, the beast would eventually shatter its cage. It would consume the man, Kael, entirely. And once it was free, its first and only instinct would be to possess the source of its obsession, the light that had woken it from its slumber. It would possess her, and it would destroy her in the process. Raina woke with a strangled gasp, sitting bolt upright in the bed. Her body was slick with sweat, her heart hammering against her ribs. The room was dark and silent, but the vision felt more real than the stone walls around her. She looked down at her right wrist. The silver spiral mark was glowing with a soft, steady, determined light. Her fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach. But something new had taken root beside it, a terrifying, electrifying sense of purpose. Her whole life, she had seen her gift as a curse, a secret to be hidden at all costs. She had been running from it, just as she had run from the men who'd killed her mother. But the goddess's message had changed everything. This gift wasn't meant to be hidden. It was meant to heal him. Her goal was no longer just to survive. It was to save him. To save them both. She stood up, her legs steady, her gaze fixed on the locked door. She had to get to Kael. She had to make him understand. She was no longer a passive survivor reacting to the world. She was a healer, and she was about to go on the attack. Her deception was over. Now, her truth would be her weapon. Chapter 13. An Act of Treason. The moon hanging outside Raina's window was not yet full, but it was a sliver short of it, casting a strange, sickly light across the land. A palpable wrongness had settled over the northern pack. It was a low hum of anxiety in the air, a restless energy that made the guards outside her door shift and mutter. Raina felt it coiling in her gut. Her vision from the goddess had warned her the curse was accelerating, growing more volatile. This felt like the beginning of the storm. A howl suddenly ripped through the night. It was not the proud, unified call of the pack. This was a sound of pure, unadulterated agony. It was a sound of bones breaking and a soul tearing apart. It was Kael. Panic, cold and sharp, seized her. He wasn't in the silver cell. She would have felt the muffled vibrations through the stone floor. He was outside, unchained. The goddess's words echoed in her mind. He will destroy you both. Her first instinct was to hide, to cower behind the locked door and pray the storm would pass. But that was the old Raina. That was the girl who survived by running. The healer, the woman who had seen the truth in the goddess's star-filled gaze, knew she could not run. She had to face the beast. The door was her first obstacle. The lock was old, solid iron. A command from the Alpha. To open it would be treason. She didn't care. Her mother had taught her more than just herbs and poultices. She had taught her how to observe. Raina had watched the guards, noted the way they carried their keys, the way the lock sometimes stuck. She searched the room, her eyes landing on the thin, sturdy pin holding the clasp on a small wooden box. With trembling fingers, she worked it free. It wasn't a key, but it might be enough. She knelt at the door, her ear pressed against the wood, listening to the frantic shouts from outside. She slid the pin into the lock, her breath held tight in her chest, and began to work, her touch surprisingly delicate. It took an eternity, each scrape of metal a lifetime of fear, until she felt a faint click. The lock had given. She slipped out into the empty corridor and ran, following the sounds of chaos. She burst out into the main settlement. The pack was in disarray. Wolves in their human forms running for the safety of their homes, their faces pale with fear. Kael had fled into the forest. They were shouting towards the cliffs. He was trying to protect them from himself. Raina didn't hesitate. She plunged into the dark woods, the sickly moonlight her only guide. She found him in a small clearing. The sight stole the breath from her lungs. He was caught in a horrifying, uncontrolled transformation. It wasn't the swift, fluid shift of the full moon. This was a violent battle, his human form fighting a losing war against the beast. One arm was elongated, covered in black fur and tipped with vicious claws, while the other was still human. His face was a contorted mask of pain. The beast was winning, his head snapped up and two burning gold eyes fixed on her. A snarl ripped from his throat, a sound that held no recognition, only raw, predatory instinct. He saw her not as his anchor, not as his mate, but as prey. He lunged. The girl who had collapsed at his border would have run. The liar who had fooled his pack would have screamed, but the healer stood her ground. "Kael!" she shouted, her voice a sharp command in the chaos. As the monstrous form leaped through the air, she threw her hands forward. A wave of brilliant silver light erupted from her palms, not a weapon, but a shield of pure, calming energy. It slammed into the beast, and for a second, it faltered, its charge broken. But the curse was too strong, the rage too deep. It roared and swiped, its claws tearing through her energy and her flesh. A searing pain exploded in her side as she was thrown backward, crashing against the hard roots of an oak tree. The world tilted, her vision blurring. Through a haze of pain, she saw the beast freeze, its head cocked. The scent of her blood, of his blood, filled the air. It seemed to cut through the rage, a shocking, terrible clarity. The monstrous form shuddered, then collapsed, the transformation reversing with violent speed until Kael, the man, lay naked and unconscious on the forest floor. He woke moments later to the coppery smell of blood. His blood. No. Her blood. It was on his hands, a dark stain in the pale moonlight. And it was a sin his soul would never forget. Chapter 14. A Kiss of Fury and Grace. Kael knelt in the dirt, staring at the blood on his hands as if it were acid. His own hands, his own claws. He had hurt her, the one person his wolf screamed to protect, the one anchor in the raging storm of his soul. And he had torn her flesh. A wave of self-loathing so powerful it threatened to drown him washed over him. He looked at her, crumpled at the base of the tree, her face pale, a dark stain spreading across the side of her green tunic. Her breath was coming in shallow gasps. He scrambled to her side, his movements jerky and uncoordinated. "Raina," he choked out, his voice a raw, broken thing. He reached for her, his touch surprisingly gentle as he gathered her into his arms. She was so light, so fragile. And he was a monster. The walk back to the lodge was a blur of shame and rising panic. Guards saw them, their eyes widening at the sight of their alpha carrying his bleeding, wounded mate. Whispers erupted behind them like wildfire, questions and accusations that he didn't have the strength to answer. He carried her straight to his chambers, bypassing the healer's den, and laid her gently on his bed. The wound on her side was long and deep, but by some miracle the claws had missed anything vital. He worked with a desperate urgency, cleaning the wound with water and wrapping it with clean linen. His hands trembled. When he was done, he stood over her, a storm of conflicting emotions warring in his eyes. He had to know. "How?" he demanded, his voice tight. "In the forest. How did you stop me?" Raina pushed herself up, wincing as pain shot through her side. The time for lies was over. They had almost gotten them both killed. "I am a moon healer, Kael," she said, her voice quiet but steady. "My gift is not just to mend flesh. It is to soothe the spirit, to calm the beast." She told him everything then, about her vision from the goddess, about his brother, the cursed arrow, the cage the goddess had built in his soul to save him. She told him the curse was growing, feeding on her presence, and that if she didn't heal him, the wolf would consume him completely. He listened, his face an unreadable mask of stone. When she was finished, he didn't look relieved. He looked furious. A low growl rumbled in his chest. "So it was all a lie," he snarled. "Everything. The fated bond. All of it was a trick to save your own life." "At first, yes," she admitted, refusing to look away. "But not anymore." He laughed, a harsh, bitter sound. "You think I don't know you lied?" He stalked toward her, his anger a living presence in the room. "The moment I saw you heal the soil, I knew. I knew you were no simple wolf. I knew you weren't my fated mate." He stopped at the edge of the bed, looming over her. But it didn't matter. His voice dropped, becoming a raw, desperate confession. "Because my wolf didn't care about the truth. It wants you. The lie doesn't matter. The truth doesn't matter. All that matters is that it refuses to let you go." He was trapped. His rational mind knew she had deceived him. His alpha pride was wounded by the trick. But his primal soul, the caged and tormented beast within, needed her more than it needed air. This impossible conflict, this war within himself, finally reached its breaking point. He lunged, not in attack, but in surrender. He grabbed her face in his hands, his thumbs stroking her cheeks as if she were the most precious, hated thing in the world. And then he kissed her. It was not a gentle kiss. It was a kiss of fury and desperation, of punishment and worship all at once. It was a collision of his anger at her lie and his soul-deep need for her touch. It was rough and demanding, a raw outpouring of every confusing, terrifying emotion he had felt since she fell across his border. But beneath the fury, there was something else, a current of profound tenderness, a desperate, aching longing. Raina's mind went blank. She didn't respond with fear, but with an instinct that came from a place deeper than reason. She kissed him back, meeting his desperate energy with her own, a silent confession of the feelings she hadn't even admitted to herself. The kiss broke them apart, leaving them both breathless, their foreheads resting against each other. The air was electric, the world outside forgotten. The line between healer and patient, captive and captor, had just been burned away, leaving them bound by a truth that was far more powerful and infinitely more dangerous than any lie. Chapter 15. The Purpose of a Lie. The fragile, supercharged peace forged by their kiss was shattered by the distant, mournful cry of a war horn. The sound echoed from the borders, a clear and undeniable signal of invasion. Kael pulled back from her, the raw emotion on his face instantly replaced by the hard mask of the Alpha. Another horn answered from the watchtower, and the settlement below erupted into a frenzy of shouts and the clang of steel on steel. A scout, breathless and blood-splattered, burst into the chambers moments later without knocking. "Alpha, it's Lucan Ward. He's crossed the southern border with his entire war party," the wolf panted, handing Kael a pointed spear with the Southern Pack's banner tied to it. Attached to the banner was a piece of parchment. Kael tore it free and read it, his face grim. "He's declared war," he said, his voice a low, lethal calm. "He charges us with breaking the ancient law, with harboring a magical aberration that threatens the balance of our lands." He crumpled the parchment in his fist. He was talking about her. Lucen was using her as his excuse, his righteous justification for a land grab he had likely been planning for years. The lodge became a whirlwind of organized chaos. Warriors in black leather armor strapped on blades and filled quivers. Betas shouted orders. The air hummed with the energy of a pack preparing for war. Kael stood in the center of it all, a storm of quiet, focused lethality. He moved with a purpose Raina had never seen before, his commands sharp and precise. He was every inch the Alpha, the protector of his people. Raina found him in his study as he strapped a heavy leather bracer onto his forearm. The sight of him preparing for battle, for a war that she had caused, sent a spear of ice-cold fear through her heart. "Don't go," she pleaded, her voice barely a whisper. "This is what he wants. He's baiting you. There has to be another way." He stopped what he was doing and turned to face her. His eyes, burning with that golden wolf fire, held a fierce, unwavering light. "There is no other way," he said, his voice low and intense. He took a step closer to her, his gaze unwavering. "You don't understand, Raina. For a decade, I have not been an Alpha. I have been a warden, a zookeeper. My only job was to keep the monster in my soul from tearing this pack apart. I was ruling from a cage, merely surviving." He reached out and gently touched the bandage on her side, his own handiwork. "But your lie, your presence here, it did something I thought was impossible." A grim, almost feral smile touched his lips. "It woke my wolf from its slumber. It reminded me what it feels like to have something to protect, to have something to fight for." His words struck her with the force of a physical blow. The terrible, beautiful irony of it all crashed down on her. Her lie, the thing she had created out of pure, selfish fear, had been the key to his cage. It had given this broken, tormented man a reason to live beyond his own pain. It had rekindled the Alpha fire in his soul, giving him the very strength he now needed to lead his people into battle. He finished strapping on his armor and picked up a massive, broad-bladed sword from his desk. He was a king going to war. As he walked past her towards the door, he paused, his hand brushing hers. "Stay inside. Stay safe," he commanded softly. She watched him stride out of the room, his broad shoulders filling the doorway, the undisputed leader of his pack. And in that moment, as she watched him go to face a war that could very well kill him, she finally had to face the most dangerous truth of all. The healer had fallen for the beast. The survivor loved the man. She, Raina Vale, was hopelessly in love with Kael Draven, and he was marching to his possible death because of a lie she had told to live. Chapter 16. The Serpent's Truth. The battlefield was a wound on the earth, littered with the grim aftermath of the day's fighting. A tense quiet had fallen as the sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in bruised shades of purple and orange. Under a white banner of truce, the two packs met in the center of the blood-soaked clearing. Kael stood tall and unyielding, a king made of iron and shadow. Raina was at his side, her presence a silent declaration of his cause. Across from them, Lucen Ward waited, his expression calm, his smile as unsettling as a snake's. He hadn't come to surrender. He had come to strike a different kind of blow. "You have fought bravely, Kael," Lucen began, his voice carrying across the silent field. "You fight for your land. You fight for your honor. But you have been deceived. You are not fighting for a mate." A nervous murmur rippled through both packs. Kael's hand rested on the pommel of his sword, his knuckles white. "You are fighting for a weapon," Lucen continued, his voice rising with theatrical pity. He unfurled a scroll, its parchment so ancient it was nearly translucent. "I have spent much time in the old libraries searching for answers to your condition, and I found them. I found a story, a prophecy." He let his words hang in the air, capturing everyone's attention. He spoke of an ancient curse, a splinter of a silver-forged arrow that could poison an alpha's soul, caging his wolf and turning it to rage. A curse that could not be mended by ordinary means. "There is only one cure," Lucen proclaimed, his eyes finding Raina in the crowd. "A power so great it requires the ultimate sacrifice, the life force of a moon healer, willingly given, bound to the alpha's soul. A bond that heals the wolf, but consumes the healer, burning her life away like a candle flame until nothing is left." Ice flooded Raina's veins. He knew. He had not just discovered who she was, he had unearthed the most sacred and dangerous secret of her lineage. This was the truth she had seen in the goddess's vision, not a curse, but a choice, a sacrifice. Lucen pointed a dramatic finger at her. "And here she stands, Raina Vale, last of the moon healers. She did not come to you by fate, Kael. She came to you as a lamb to the slaughter, a suicidal martyr intending to shame you with her death. Or worse, a manipulative witch seeking to control you by becoming the only thing that could save you." A collective gasp went through the crowd. Kael went rigid, his face becoming a mask of cold, unreadable fury. He turned his head slowly, his glacial eyes locking onto hers. In them, she saw not love, not the fragile connection they had built, but the ice-cold suspicion of a king who has just discovered a serpent in his bed. He felt like a fool. He thought of her lies, her secrets, and now this. To him, it was the final, most profound betrayal. She hadn't just lied about being his mate. She had planned to die, to manipulate his very soul with her sacrifice. The intimacy they had shared now felt like a violation. "Is it true?" he bit out, his voice so low and deadly it was more frightening than any shout. "Kael, it's not like that," she began, her own voice trembling. How could she explain a choice she had only just made herself? How could she explain the goddess's will in the middle of a battlefield? But he didn't want an explanation. He wanted an answer, and her hesitation was all the confirmation he needed. He had been played. His pack was being threatened. His warriors were dying, all because he had trusted a liar. He turned back to face the two packs, his expression carved from stone. He had to cut out the poison. He had to save his pack, his authority. He had to choose. And in front of everyone, he made his choice. He raised his voice, a clear, ringing command that echoed with the brutal finality of a death sentence. "This woman is no mate of mine. She is a liar and a witch who has brought nothing but war to our lands." He pointed at her, not as his anchor, but as his enemy. "She is banished. Cast her out. If she is ever seen on northern Packlands again, kill her on sight." Chapter 17. The Echo of a Howl. The words struck Raina with the force of a physical blow, knocking the air from her lungs. Banished. The world around her seemed to warp and fade, the shocked faces of the pack, Lucen's triumphant smirk, all of it blurring into an indistinct haze. Two of Kael's guards, the same wolves who had watched her with awe just days ago, grabbed her arms. Their touch was rough, their faces hard and unforgiving. They looked at her with contempt. She was no longer their Luna. She was a disease being purged. She didn't struggle. She couldn't. Her body was numb, her spirit shattered. She risked one last look at Kael. He was staring straight ahead, his jaw clenched, his face a mask of cold, remote authority. He would not look at her. He had already erased her from his world. That look, or lack of it, hurt more than the sentence itself. They dragged her away from the battlefield, away from the life she had briefly, foolishly thought could be hers. They marched her through the forest for what felt like miles, their silence a heavy, suffocating blanket. When they finally reached the unmarked border of the territory, they shoved her forward, making her stumble into the wild, unclaimed lands between the packs. "Don't come back!" one of them spat, the words dripping with venom. Then they turned and disappeared back into the shadows of the forest, leaving her utterly and completely alone. The first few days were a blur of mindless survival. She walked without direction, her feet carrying her forward, while her mind was lost in a fog of grief. She foraged for berries her mother had taught her were safe, the familiar act a painful echo of a happier time. She found shelter in the hollow of a fallen log or beneath the rocky overhang of a small cliff. The physical hardship, the hunger, the cold, the constant dampness, was nothing. It was the crushing weight of her despair that threatened to pull her under. She had lost everything: her home, her people, and now, the only man she had ever allowed herself to love. One night, as she huddled under a makeshift shelter of pine boughs, a sound drifted through the darkness. A howl. Her heart stopped. It was him. It was Kael. But it was a sound she had never heard from him before. It was not the proud call of an alpha or the savage roar of the beast. It was a long, mournful, soul-shattering cry of pure, undiluted agony. It was the sound of a man being torn apart from the inside, a sound of unbearable loneliness. Her anchor was gone. The calming presence his wolf had craved was ripped away, and now the beast was in ascendance. He had cast her out to save himself, but in doing so, he had severed his own lifeline. The howls came every night after that. Each one was a fresh torment, a reminder of what she had lost and what he was suffering. And with each passing night, the sound changed. It became wilder, less human. The notes of grief and pain were being drowned out by a rising tide of pure, untamed rage. The man was losing his fight. She was wandering the wilderness, her body growing weaker, her spirit fading, and he was trapped in his own skin, his soul being devoured by the monster he had tried so hard to cage. They were dying, just in different ways, on opposite sides of a border he had drawn between them. Chapter 18. The Fading Mark. A cold, miserable rain began to fall, turning the forest floor into a slick, muddy mess. It soaked Raina to the bone, leaching the last of the warmth from her body. She was weak, her limbs heavy with an exhaustion that went far deeper than physical fatigue. For days, she had been running on the fumes of grief and adrenaline. Now, there was nothing left. She stumbled, her knees giving out, and slumped to the ground at the base of a great, weeping willow. She didn't have the strength to get up again. The rain plastered her thin tunic to her skin, and she began to shiver, a violent, uncontrollable trembling. This was it, she thought, with a strange sense of detachment. This was how it ended. Not in a blaze of glory, not in a noble sacrifice, but shivering and alone in the mud. She was just another lost girl, another forgotten victim in a world that had no place for her. She listlessly lifted her arm, her gaze falling upon her wrist. The silver spiral mark, the symbol of her gift, the very core of her identity, was fading. The light that had once pulsed with a steady silver fire was now a dim, flickering glimmer, like the last ember of a dying fire. It was a reflection of her own spirit. With no one to heal, with no purpose to cling to, her power was extinguishing itself. It was abandoning her, just as everyone else had. Her connection to her gift, to her mother, to herself was severing. She closed her eyes, a wave of resignation washing over her. She was so tired. Tired of running, tired of fighting, tired of lying. It would be so easy to just let go. To let the rain wash her away, to let the cold take her, to simply fade into the forest floor along with her mark. She had failed. She had failed Kael. She had failed herself. This was the end. In that moment of absolute surrender, when all the fear and pain and struggle fell away, a single quiet thought bloomed in the darkness of her mind. A memory. The goddess's whisper, not as a warning, but as a simple, clear instruction. Heal him. It was not a suggestion, it was her purpose. Then she thought of Lucen's words on the battlefield, the prophecy he had twisted into a weapon, a bond that heals the wolf but consumes the healer. He had called it a death sentence. But what if it wasn't? What if it was a choice? Her whole life she had viewed her power as a dangerous secret to be hidden, a curse that had gotten her mother killed. But she was wrong. It wasn't a curse. It was a key forged for the specific, intricate lock on Kael Draven's soul. To let it fade, to run from its purpose, was the only true death. Her eyes snapped open. The rain was still pouring. The world was still cold and gray and miserable. Nothing outside had changed, but inside her a tiny, defiant ember flared back to life. She would not die here. She would not fade away into nothing. She would not let Lucen win. She would not let Kael be consumed. With a groan that was part pain and part pure, unyielding will, she pushed herself up onto her hands and knees. Her muscles screamed, her body trembled with cold and weakness, but she got her feet under her. She stood, swaying, clinging to the trunk of the willow for support. A new light kindled in her eyes, a fierce and absolute resolve that burned away the despair. The prophecy was not her doom. It was her destiny. And she would face it on her own terms. "I'll save him," she whispered to the storm, her voice a raw, ragged thing that was somehow stronger than any shout. She took a shaky step, then another, turning herself back towards the northern lands, back towards him. "Even if it kills me." Chapter 19. The Queen's Return. The border of the Northern Pack's territory was no longer an invisible line on the forest floor. To Raina's newly awakened senses, it was a shimmering curtain of energy, a wall of power that hummed with the collective strength of Kael's pack. It was a barrier meant to keep enemies out. Her hand trembled as she lifted it. She was an enemy. She was banished. To cross this line was to invite the death sentence he had ordered himself. She took a deep breath, the cold, damp air filling her lungs, and stepped through. The moment her foot touched northern soil, the world went silent for a heartbeat, and then a deep, resonant hum vibrated through the earth. An alarm. A warning that a foreign power had breached their defenses. She didn't run. She had been running her whole life, and it had led her here, to this moment. There was nowhere left to run but toward the fire. She stood in the middle of a small clearing, her back straight, and waited. It didn't take long. She heard them before she saw them, their heavy, urgent footsteps crashing through the undergrowth. A patrol of 5 warriors burst into the clearing, their swords already drawn, their faces set in grim, determined lines. It was the same guard who had escorted her into exile, their leader a broad-shouldered wolf named Fendrel, whose eyes were as hard as river stones. His gaze fell upon her, and his face tightened with a mixture of shock and cold fury. "The witch!" he snarled, raising his blade. "You were warned never to return. Kael's law is absolute." Raina met his gaze without flinching. The fear was there, a cold flutter in her stomach, but it was no longer her master. It was simply a passenger. "I have not come to defy your alpha," she said, her voice clear and steady, carrying an authority that made the warriors pause. "I have come to save him." Fendrel let out a harsh laugh. "Save him? You are the disease that has been poisoning him." She knew then that words were useless. They were loyal to their alpha's command, blinded by his pain and her deception. She had to show them a different truth, a deeper law. She closed her eyes for a moment, reaching inward, not for the frantic, panicked power she had suppressed for so long, but for the calm, deep well of it that the goddess had shown her. She let it rise. She opened her eyes, and they were glowing with a soft, internal silver light. The spiral mark on her wrist, which had been so dim and faded, now blazed to life, a miniature galaxy of brilliant silver. The air around her grew warm, thrumming with an ancient, vital energy. The dying leaves at her feet stirred, and the very scent of the air changed from decay to the clean, fresh smell of spring rain and blooming moon petal flowers. She had not raised a hand. She had not spoken a threat. She had simply revealed herself. The 5 hardened warriors froze. Their swords suddenly felt heavy and useless in their hands. They were creatures of instinct, of spirit and soul, and every instinct they possessed was screaming at them. Their wolf souls, which had bristled with aggression moments before, were now quiet, awed. They were not facing a witch. They were in the presence of something sacred, a power as old as the moon itself. Fendrel's eyes were wide, his mouth slightly agape. The fury in his face had been replaced by a look of profound, terrified reverence. The sword slowly lowered to his side. He tried to fight it, his loyalty to Kael warring with the undeniable truth his soul was screaming at him. But the instinct was too strong. With a shudder that racked his entire body, the big warrior dropped to one knee, his head bowed. One by one, the other 4 followed his lead, their swords clattering softly on the forest floor as they knelt in the mud before her. They were kneeling to the power that their alpha's wolf had recognized from the very beginning. Raina looked down at the 5 kneeling warriors, her heart filled not with triumph but with a deep, aching sorrow for the path that lay ahead. Her voice was soft, yet it carried the weight of an undeniable command. Take me to him, now. Chapter 20. The Heart of the Storm. The journey back was a strange, silent procession. The 5 warriors who had been her captors were now her honor guard, their faces a mixture of fear and a dawning, fanatical hope. As they approached the main settlement, a hush fell over the pack. Wolves emerged from their longhouses, their faces pale and drawn. The air was thick with the smell of fear and the coppery tang of spilled blood. The sounds of splintering wood and a monstrous, unceasing roar echoed from the great hall at the center of the compound. They had barricaded him inside. The pack parted for her like a river around a stone. They stared at her, at the unwavering light in her eyes and the glowing mark on her wrist. They didn't know what she was, but they saw that the warriors with her, some of Kael's most trusted, were treating her like a queen. Hope, a desperate, fragile thing, began to kindle in their eyes. She was their last chance. Fendrel stopped her before the massive, splintered doors of the great hall. He has been like this since the night you left, he said, his voice low and grim. The beast. It has taken him. We cannot get near him. Raina placed a hand on the heavy oak door. She could feel the violent, chaotic energy radiating from within, a storm of rage and pain. I am not afraid of him, she said softly. Only for him. She looked at Fendrel, opened the doors, and let no one else inside. He nodded, and with the help of 2 other warriors, heaved the heavy bar away. The doors swung inward with a groan, revealing a scene of utter devastation. The great hall, once a place of community and order, was destroyed. Benches were smashed to kindling, tapestries torn from the walls, deep gouges scarred the floor and support beams. And in the center of the chaos was Kael. He was a nightmare given form, trapped in the horrifying state between man and beast. His body was a twisted mockery of his human shape, elongated and covered in patches of coarse black fur. One hand was a man's, the other a wolf's, tipped with claws dripping with his own blood. His golden eyes held no reason, no recognition. They were the eyes of the curse, burning with the mindless, insatiable rage of a caged animal that had finally broken free. He saw her. The beast let out a roar that was pure, primal fury, a sound that shook the very foundations of the building. It lowered its head and charged, its claws tearing up the floorboards as it came. This was the monster that had wounded her, the beast she had fled. But as it thundered toward her, Raina felt no fear. All she felt was a love so fierce and so profound it became a shield. Her heart broke for the man trapped inside that tormented form, for the soul she had seen in the silver cell, for the alpha who had fought so hard and for so long. She stood her ground in the center of the hall, a point of stillness in the heart of the storm. She didn't raise a shield of light. She didn't prepare an attack. She simply held out a hand, her palm open in a gesture of peace, of surrender. "Kael," she said, her voice not a shout, but a clear, resonant call that cut through the beast's roar. It was a sound of pure love, laced with a pain that mirrored his own. The charging monster faltered, its massive head tilting in confusion. The sound of his name, spoken with such tenderness, had pierced the red haze of its rage. "It's me," she whispered, tears streaming down her face now. "I'm here. I'm not leaving you again." She took a step toward him, then another. "Come back to me, Kael, please. Come back." For a single, agonizing moment, the golden fury in the beast's eyes wavered. A flicker of something else shone through. Confusion, pain, memory. A flicker of the man. It was a tiny crack in the prison of its rage, a hairline fracture in the curse's hold. But it was the only opening she would get, and as the beast stood there, momentarily paralyzed by the war within, she surged forward, closing the last few feet between them, her hand outstretched to touch the heart of the storm. Chapter 21. A bond of light and shadow. Her fingers touched his chest. The skin was hot, the coarse fur bristling with a chaotic, violent energy. The beast flinched, a roar of confusion and pain tearing from its throat as her touch sent a shockwave through its system. It was a touch it craved and a touch it feared, the source of its obsession and the thing that could tame it. It raised a clawed hand, hesitating between a strike and an embrace. Raina looked up into the tormented golden eyes of the monster and saw the man drowning within. This was her purpose. This was her choice. "I love you," she whispered, the 3 words she had realized too late, the truth she had to give him now, even if he couldn't understand. They were her final gift and her greatest weapon. She closed her eyes and let go. She surrendered to her power, to her destiny, to the prophecy she had once feared. She unleashed everything. The silver mark on her wrist did not just glow, it detonated. A silent, impossible explosion of pure white light erupted from her, consuming him, consuming the entire hall. It was not a gentle, healing wave. It was a supernova of life force, a torrent of every ounce of power she possessed. The light poured from her hand into his chest, a silver river surging against the black, stagnant corruption of his curse. She felt her own energy draining away with terrifying speed, a burning, hollowing emptiness that started in her core and spread through her limbs. The prophecy was coming true. She was giving him her life. Her mind, her very soul, was swept along with the light, plunging deep into his. She was no longer in the great hall. She was in the ravaged landscape of Kael's spirit. She saw the cage the goddess had built, now shattered and broken. She saw the beast, his wolf spirit, snarling and afraid. And behind it, she saw the source of all his pain, the festering, decade-old wound of his brother's death. The memory was a living thing, a shard of shadow in his soul. She saw the ambush, felt his grief, his rage, his guilt. She saw how the curse had latched onto that wound, feeding on it, twisting his wolf into a creature of pure pain. Her power, guided by her love, did not just attack the darkness. It surrounded the memory. It washed over the image of his fallen brother, not with forgetting, but with peace. It showed the beast not a memory of loss, but one of love and loyalty. She poured every good, pure thing she had ever felt into that wound. The memory of her mother's smile, the scent of wildflowers in the sun, the impossible, fierce love she felt for the man beneath the monster. She wasn't just breaking the curse. She was healing the reason it had taken root. She felt the darkness dissolve. She felt the rage in his wolf spirit quiet, replaced by a profound, weary gratitude. She felt the man, Kael, his consciousness, which had been submerged for so long, finally surface. He reached for her in that space between souls, his spiritual form grasping hers. Raina. Her name was a silent, grateful prayer. The light in the great hall intensified, becoming a solid, blinding white. It was impossible to look at, a sun born between them. Raina felt the last of her strength, the last of her life force pour out of her in one final, triumphant surge. Her physical body went limp, her connection to the world severing. Her last sensation was of falling into an endless, peaceful silence. Then the light vanished as quickly as it had appeared. Silence. Absolute, deafening silence descended upon the great hall, broken only by the soft whisper of dust motes dancing in the sudden twilight. The battle was over. The storm had passed, but the cost was terrifyingly, heartbreakingly unknown. Chapter 22. The price of a soul consciousness returned to Kael not as a gentle dawn, but as a tidal wave. For the first time in a decade, he was wholly himself. The gnawing rage, the silent, snarling beast that had been his constant companion, the cold weight of the curse, it was all gone. He could feel his own wolf settled peacefully in his soul, a calm, warm presence he had forgotten was possible. He was free. He was whole. The air he drew into his lungs felt clean, new. Then, memory crashed down upon him. Raina. He pushed himself up from the floor of the ruined hall. He was human, healed, and completely naked. But he barely noticed. His eyes found her immediately. She was a pale, still form crumpled on the floor where the light had been, her green tunic dark with her own blood. He scrambled to her side, his heart, which had just begun to beat with a new sense of freedom, now seizing with a cold, absolute dread. "Raina," he whispered, his voice hoarse. He touched her cheek. She was cold, so cold. The vibrant life that had buzzed around her, the stubborn fire in her eyes, was gone. He pressed his ear to her chest, praying, begging to hear a heartbeat. There was nothing. No breath. No pulse. Only a devastating, final stillness. He looked at her wrist, the one that had borne the blazing silver mark. The skin was clear. The mark was gone, as if it had never been. The prophecy had been fulfilled. She had poured her life into him, and now her candle was extinguished. He had his soul back, but the price had been hers. The price was everything. A sound tore from his throat, a raw, ragged cry that was not a wolf's howl or a man's shout, but something in between, the sound of a soul being ripped in two. All his control, the iron discipline that had defined his entire life, shattered into a million pieces. He gathered her limp, lifeless body into his arms, holding her tight against his chest, as if his warmth alone could bring her back. Tears, hot and foreign, streamed down his face, the first he had shed since his brother's death. They fell onto her pale cheeks, tiny dark spots on her cool skin. "No," he choked out, rocking her gently. "No, you can't. You can't leave me." He buried his face in her hair, the faint scent of wildflowers and rain a fresh torment. "I'm sorry," he wept, the words a torrent of confession and regret. "For my pride, for my doubt, for ever letting you go." He pulled back, looking at her peaceful, still face. He had never told her. He had let his anger and his pride stand in the way, and now it was too late. "I love you, Raina," he confessed to the silence, his voice breaking. "Don't leave me. Please. I love you." As the words left his lips, a single tear fell from his eye and landed directly on her wrist, on the spot where the silver mark had been. For a second, nothing happened. Then a faint, reddish gold light, the color of embers and sunrise, flickered beneath her skin. It was not the cool silver light of the moon. It was a warm, living glow. Kael's breath caught in his throat. He stared, unblinking, as the light pulsed again, stronger this time. He pressed his fingers to her chest, searching, desperate. And then he felt it. Faint, thready, but there. Thump, a single slow heartbeat. Thump, thump, another. Her eyelids fluttered. A soft, small breath escaped her lips. The color began to seep back into her skin, a warm blush chasing away the cold pallor of death. Her eyes opened, no longer silver bright, but their own beautiful clear hazel. They focused on his face, and in them he saw not pain or fear, but a deep and profound love that mirrored his own. She lifted a weak hand, her fingers gently touching his tear-streaked cheek. Her voice was a bare whisper, but it was the most beautiful sound he had ever heard. It was the sound of his world being reborn. You were never my lie. Chapter 23. The Queen and the Land. Kael lifted her into his arms, her body weak but her spirit blazing. He was whole. She was alive. And in the ruins of the Great Hall, their bond, forged in lies and reforged in sacrifice, was finally pure. He carried her out of the shadows of the hall and into the first gentle rays of the rising sun. The entire northern pack was gathered in the clearing, a silent, waiting sea of faces filled with fear and desperate hope. They had heard the roars, seen the impossible light, and then nothing. They saw him first. Their alpha. Not the tormented half-beast of the curse, but the man. The wolf. Whole. Healed. A collective gasp of pure, unadulterated shock and joy rippled through the crowd. Their king was restored. Then they saw the woman in his arms. She was pale and wounded, but she was alive, her eyes open, her hand resting on his chest. Kael stopped before his people, Raina held securely in his arms. He was their alpha, but he was no longer the cold, remote ruler he had been forced to be. The ice around his heart had been melted, and the warmth showed on his face, in the fierce, protective light in his eyes. "The curse is broken," he announced, his voice clear and strong, ringing with an authority that was no longer brittle, but deep and resonant. He looked down at Raina, his voice softening so only she and the wolves with the sharpest ears could hear. Because of her. He turned his gaze back to his pack. She did not bring war to our lands. She brought salvation. She is a moon healer, and she is my mate, not by a lie of fate, but by a bond of sacrifice and truth. A wave of understanding and profound shame washed over the pack. They remembered their suspicion, their contempt, the way they had allowed her to be cast out. Fendrel, the warrior who had physically shoved her into exile, pushed his way to the front of the crowd. His face was a mask of deep, personal shame. He dropped to one knee in the dirt, bowing his head so low his forehead nearly touched the ground. His voice, when he spoke, was thick with emotion. "My queen," he said, the words a pledge, an apology, and an oath all in one. It was a spark in a tinderbox. One by one, then in a great, rushing wave, every wolf in the clearing knelt. Warriors, healers, mothers, elders. They knelt before their healed alpha, and before the woman who had sacrificed everything to save him. They knelt to their Luna. Just as the last wolf knelt, a rider burst from the forest path, his horse lathered in sweat, his eyes wide with a frantic, joyous disbelief. "Alpha!" he shouted, sliding from his horse before it had even stopped. "The borderlands! The cursed lands!" "What of them?" Kael asked, his arm tightening around Raina. "They're green," the scout exclaimed, his voice cracking with emotion. "The grass. It's growing. I saw buds on the dead trees. The land. Alpha, the land is healing." A cheer, a raw, explosive sound of pure joy and relief, erupted from the kneeling pack. The curse had not just been on their alpha, it had been on their home, and now both were being reborn. Kael looked down at Raina, his face filled with a love and awe so profound it left him breathless. He had been a monster, poisoning the very earth he was sworn to protect. He leaned down and whispered in her ear, his voice thick with a gratitude that went beyond words. "You healed the monster." Raina lifted her head from his shoulder, her gaze soft but strong. She looked out at the kneeling pack, at the rising sun, at the future that had been bought at such a high price. "No," she whispered back, her fingers gently tracing the line of his jaw. "I healed the man." Chapter 24. The Bloodline's Promise. 6 months later, the northern lands were almost unrecognizable. The once barren, cursed lands were now a carpet of lush green grass and young, thriving saplings. The entire forest felt more vibrant, more alive, as if the land itself had taken a deep healing breath. The pack, too, was transformed. With their alpha Hole and their Luna at his side, a new era of peace and prosperity had begun. The war with Lucen Ward had ended abruptly with Kael's restoration. Lucen's power, built on intimidation and the perception of Kael's weakness, crumbled when faced with an alpha who was whole, healed, and bonded. A new, more equitable treaty had been forged with the Southern Pack under new leadership. Tonight, the full moon rose, a brilliant silver disk in a clear, star-dusted sky. But it held no terror. Raina stood on the balcony of their chambers now, and watched it, a gentle smile on her face. The air was cool and smelled of pine and damp earth. She felt a pair of strong arms wrap around her from behind, and she leaned back into the solid, warm wall of Kael's chest. He rested his chin on her shoulder, his presence a calm, steady comfort. "It's beautiful," he murmured, his voice a low rumble against her ear. "I haven't been able to just look at it in a long time." She turned her head and kissed him, a soft, lingering kiss filled with the quiet joy of their shared life. Their bond was a constant, gentle hum between them, a current of warmth and light that flowed both ways. His wolf, no longer a caged beast, was a part of him, a source of strength and instinct that was perfectly balanced with the man. "You're quiet tonight," he observed, his fingers lacing through hers. "Just thinking," she replied, turning back to look at the moon. She thought of the journey that had brought her here. The terrified girl fleeing a massacre felt like a different person, a ghost from another life. She had found everything she had ever wanted without even knowing she was looking for it. A home, a sense of belonging, safety, and a love so deep it had literally called her back from the edge of death. She looked down at her right hand, the one he was holding. In the bright moonlight, the mark was faintly visible. It was no longer the cool, silver spiral of the moon healer, a gift of solitary, selfless power. The new mark was a delicate, intricate tracery of reddish gold lines that interwove in a pattern that was both a wolf's paw and a blooming flower. It was not the mark of her bloodline alone. It was the mark of their bond. A new kind of power, born not just of the moon, but of the heart. Born of sacrifice and love. Kael followed her gaze, his thumb gently stroking the back of her hand, tracing the new pattern. He understood. He always seemed to understand what she was thinking now. "The curse was broken," she mused softly, her voice filled with a quiet wonder. It was a statement of fact, but also a question about the journey's true end. He leaned in and kissed her temple, his voice a warm whisper against her skin. But not erased. She smiled. He was right. The scars of their past were still there, not as wounds, but as a part of who they now were. Their story hadn't ended with the breaking of the curse. It had truly begun. Their journey had not just healed them, it had changed them, creating something entirely new. A bond that felt ancient and full of promise. And as she looked from the golden mark on her hand to the silver moon in the sky, a final, peaceful thought settled in her heart, a promise for all the generations yet to come. Some love stories never end, they just pass to the bloodline.